Hello, welcome to Module 2, Overview of Disaster Risk Management Concepts and Frameworks. As with all self-paced material, we recommend to pause the video or feel free to go back to a certain concept if you're not clear about it.
Our session for today will provide you with an overview of DRM terms and frameworks. So I'm Avelino Ave Florendo Filio Jr. I'm the Capacity Development Specialist of ADPC Academy. So this session is very interesting because we need to be cleared of terms. Before we operationalize something, the concept must at least be clear to us, the basic terms before we operationalize something. So this is the very purpose why we are having this specific session. So for this, we have two objectives. One is we'll describe the evolution of disaster risk management as a concept. So I'll take you through memory lane, how the DRM, which is what we have now, evolved. And of course, we'll be explaining selected terminologies for DRM following the UNDRR definitions given. So for the first objective, describe the evolution of the disaster risk management concept, we'll start with understanding and managing disaster, the shift in paradigm. So first, when disaster happens, we always say there's nothing we can do about it. It's an act of God. So whether it's an earthquake, a cyclone, or a flood, there's a certain level of resignation to the fate that there's really nothing we can do about it. But later on, we realized that we can still do something about it because various disciplines evolve. One of which is the natural science approach, wherein by looking at how nature behaves, clouds, wind, rise in speed of flow of river, rise in levels of rivers or water, then they'll be able to predict what will happen next. So, but that's not enough to be able to manage disaster that by looking at nature. Hence, with the development of science and technology, applied science approach in relation to disaster management was used. And one of the very interesting and practical applied science approach is what we call the GIS, if you're familiar with it, the Geo Information System, Geographical Information System. Imagine, nature science approach says that we'll be expecting heavy rains in the coming days because of certain behavior in nature. And applied science approach reinforces that by saying that when there's a typhoon that will come and it will hit a specific location, GIS will provide you with a certain map that tells how many houses are there in the locality which may be affected, how many buildings, how many kilometers of road. So this becomes very helpful. But at the end, it's still not enough to manage disasters, and more disciplines evolve. And one of which is contingency planning. So if you will notice, when we say contingency planning, the immediate thing that comes into our mind is when plan A fails, then we have to have plan B. When plan B fails, we have to have plan C. That in essence is also what you call contingency or contingency planning. But in the context of managing disasters, contingency planning is scenario-based, meaning, are we prepared for a worst case scenario? Worst case scenario. For example, in preparation for the flood or heavy rains, you prepared, for example, provisions for 200 families, okay? Evacuation for 200 families. But what if the case is that you'll have 1,000, 2,000 families affected? Are we prepared for that? are we prepared for a worst case scenario? That, in essence, is contingency planning. And then emergency management, which is the key discipline now when we're talking of humanitarian response. Always remember, all disasters are emergencies, meaning we have to act quickly to save lives. No? All disasters are emergencies, but not all emergencies are disasters. So this is one of those disciplines as well that has evolved. And quite interestingly, while we have all of this, have you noticed that with the advance in technology, as I earlier mentioned, we have a fairly accurate early warning system. But why is it so difficult to move people despite the warning, despite the high level of accuracy? So a discipline evolved like, why do people behave the way they do? So this is where we look at how groups of people behave. So hence the social science approach. So what I'm just trying to emphasize here is that each bullet, all of this must be included, must be practiced in managing disasters. Now, we don't just rely on one bullet or two bullets. So we have to consider all of this. But I wanted to emphasize this from the resignation mentality to something that to something where we can do something about it. So I think this is the gist of the session. We'll explain selected terminology for DRM, following the ISDR definition, or which is now the UNDRR. So what I'll do is, based on our experience, this session is best delivered face-to-face online. So I thought of what would be the best way for you to learn and enjoy the session. So what I'll do is I'll introduce a game. It's called Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? So I'm quite sure you're familiar with it, but there are certain questions, and I'll pause for time for you to choose the right answer. And then let's see if you got them all correctly. Right, so let's start. So it's the potential losses. It's the potential disaster losses in lives, health status, livelihoods, assets, and services which could occur to a particular community or society over some specified future time period. So what is that? So I'll just give you time. Hazard, DRR, disaster, disaster risk. What is that? So I think maybe you're quite familiar with this. So let's see the answer. So when we're talking of potential disaster losses, we're talking here of disaster risk. As we go along, we'll explain this further. So, but I hope you got the first question correctly. Next, it is a dangerous phenomenon, substance, human activity, or condition that may cause loss of lives, livelihood, services, injuries, and other health impacts. So damage and loss in properties, socioeconomic disruption. So what is that? Accident, crisis, disaster, hazard, or none of the above. So I'll just give you 5 seconds. Okay, so I'm sure you'll get this correctly because it's relatively easy. Okay, it's hazard because it is an event that may or may not happen. And if it does happen, it may cause damage and losses. Okay, so hazard. So 2 questions down. So let's see. Now, it's a serious disruption in the functioning of a community or society involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses or impacts, which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. I think the key word here is which exceeds the ability of the affected community, wherein it needs external help or assistance. So what is that? Disaster, crisis, accident, danger, letters A, B, and C. So it's a bit tricky. I'll give you 5 seconds again. So let's see. Okay, so 3 questions down. So I think most of you are still 3, no? Perfect. So let's just continue. Now, it's the characteristics and circumstances of a community, system, or asset that make it susceptible. Keyword here, susceptible or prone to the damaging effects of a hazard. Let's say a flood. So you're being prone or susceptible to the damaging effects of flood. A, sensitivity, exposure, elements at risk, vulnerability. So I'll give you 5 seconds. It's a bit confusing and tricky here. So I'm sure some of you may have answered sensitivity, some answered exposure, some answered vulnerability. Okay, I think those are the 3 closest thing to the right answer. So let's see. It's vulnerability. When you say you're vulnerable, you're susceptible, you're prone, you're close. Okay? Then people, properties, system, or other elements present in hazard zone that are thereby subject to potential losses. So I gave you a bonus already. Vulnerability is not the answer because it was already shown previously. So what is that? You would just have 4 choices. Still tricky though. So I'll give you 5 seconds. So let's see what your response is. Exposure. Right? As I earlier said, we will go back to them, to these terms as we summarize, so you'll have a better understanding. And then it's the ability of people, organization, systems using available skills and resources to face and manage the adverse conditions or emergencies or disasters. It's the opposite of vulnerability. So I think the key word here is the available skills and resources. So choices are relatively new here. Disaster risk management, community assets, coping capacity, disaster risk reduction, or resilience. So I'll give you 7 seconds because this is where the responses are almost similar. So let's see what you have come up with. It's coping capacity, right? Now, what are the 4 components of disaster risk? So if you will notice, in those choices, 4 terms were already covered. So A, risk, exposure, hazard, vulnerability. B, hazard, susceptibility, threat, and capacity. Those terms came out. Threat, exposure, capacity, susceptibility. D, hazard, vulnerability, exposure, and capacity. And E, none of the above. So check which among these terms came up already or hasn't. So 5 seconds, the 4 components of disaster risk. So let's see. So it's the hazard, vulnerability, exposure, capacity. So when we're talking of disaster risk components, no, disaster risk is made up of hazard times exposure times vulnerability over capacity. So in essence, this is not a mathematical formula. It's a formula to show relationships, you know, that brings about disaster risk. What again is disaster risk? Potential losses. And the course is disaster risk communication. So what do we need to communicate? The disaster risk, the potential losses in lives, properties, among others. So further, I would like to show to you here, disaster risk. Look at this building, no? Okay, if there's a flood, what are potential losses there? The lives of people, the livelihood, the properties inside. No? So that's disaster risk. Now, there will only be losses if there's the hazard, which is flood, and you're vulnerable to it, meaning you're susceptible. Remember our earlier definition. You're susceptible to it, and you're exposed to it, and you have limited capacity. So remember in math, right? Any number multiplied by 0 is 0. So there will be no losses even if there's flood, and even if you're vulnerable to it, but you're not exposed to it. So there will be no disaster losses. Even if there's flood and you're exposed to it, but you're not vulnerable, there's also no problem. Now, where does capacity comes in, or coping capacity? So look at it. The capacity, look, and exposure, vulnerability, look, it's inversely proportional, meaning if you want to increase capacity, or if you increase capacity, then you reduce vulnerability and exposure. The lower the capacity, the higher the vulnerability and exposure. So remember, the critical role, communication, the critical role, disaster risk communication in this simple formula. Okay, you want to reduce disaster risk. How? By increasing the capacity. And disaster risk communication plays a very big part. You will realize that as you move along the sessions in the coming days, as you go through more materials. Now, here I emphasize in red, the knowledge and capacities developed to, take note of the black one, effectively anticipate, respond to, and recover from. Meaning, before my earlier example of the hazardous flood, meaning knowledge and capacities developed before the flood happens, okay? Respond to during the floods, and recover from after the floods, okay? So knowledge and capacities developed, okay, to effectively anticipate, respond to, and recover from the impacts of floods, as an example. Before, during, and after. So I'll give you 5 seconds. Disaster risk management, DRR, coping capacity, preparedness, none of the above. So I'm certain some of you responded DRM, some DRR, a few none of the above, and some responded answered preparedness. So let's see. Correct. It is preparedness. Remember, effectively anticipate before it happens. That's why there's what we call prevention, okay, mitigation. Now, respond to, that's why there's what you call preparedness for response and recovery. So it's all about preparedness. Almost done. And then set of capacities needed to generate, I think the very important words here are generate timely and meaningful information. That's one, okay? To prepare and to act appropriately and in sufficient time. There's the urgency required here. So DRM, disaster risk management, prevention, early warning system. All of the above. So let's see. So it's early warning system because it's generating timely and meaningful. When you say meaningful information, something that makes sense to them, something that's important to them. So when we discuss disaster risk communication in details, it's imperative. No? Eventually, the components and the principle of early warning system will be covered. And lastly, it is the way in which a person acts in response to a particular situation or stimulus. It is, take note, it is ultimately what disaster risk communication wants to influence or wants to change. Knowledge, belief, attitude, behavior, or all of the above. This is tricky. I'll give you 5 seconds. Okay, so some of you might be wondering, no, it should be all of the above. You're correct there. But what I'm trying to say is ultimately, why do we do risk communication? So that they will change their behavior. They will act accordingly. So if I were to go back, you do change knowledge. You do change their belief. We try to change their attitude. But even if you were able to change their knowledge and they become more knowledgeable and aware, even if they change belief and attitude, it's not a guarantee that there's a change in behavior. And my favorite example is this: knowledge, belief, and attitude. Smoking kills. Smoking is dangerous to your health. Everybody knows that. That's a common knowledge. Okay, it's a belief. But why is it that even those who believe that smoking is dangerous to their health, they still smoke? So I think the last slide here I want to show is disaster risk communication. At the end is we want to see change in behavior. Okay, most risk communication fail because what they just wanted is raise awareness. So raising awareness is not the end. It's the means to an end. And the end must be change in behavior. Right? So in summary, we've discussed earlier, there were examples of I didn't define DRR, disaster risk management, so there were in the choices. But let's make things clear. Now, so when we're talking of DM, disaster management, you're simply talking of events as it happens. So when there's a flood, which is my earlier example, when there's flood or earthquake or drought, okay, you can simply respond and recover. Can you still prepare when earthquake is there? Not anymore. You can just respond and later recover. When there's a flood, can you still prepare? Not anymore. You'll just have to respond and recover later on. Now, why is there an overlap in circles? Because there's also what you call early recovery activities. In fact, part of the some response like food for work, cleaning debris, while it's a response operation, in essence, is also a early recovery activity. So there's a certain level of overlap in there. On the other side of the circle, we have DRR. Disaster risk reduction is an everyday thing. It's an everyday task that we need to do. And it involves three important things. Prevention, meaning outright avoidance of the impact of an event, let's say flood or cyclone. Can you prevent flood and cyclone? No. Or can you prevent cyclone? No. But you can prevent its impact. We're looking here of impact. Okay, outright avoidance. But in case you cannot prevent or outrightly avoid the impact, then you can at least mitigate or lessen the impact. And of course, preparedness, which is the bigger circle. Now, as I earlier pointed out, preparedness overlaps with disaster management because there's what you call preparedness for response and preparedness for recovery. In fact, the quality of your response and recovery is measured by how well you prepared. Okay? And the biggest circle is what you call the disaster risk management. And disaster risk management facilitates sustainable development. And take note, disaster risk communication plays a very big part because, again, disaster risks are what? Potential losses. And in each of this circle, communication plays a vital part in prevention, mitigation, preparedness, even in response and recovery. So that, in essence, are the relationships, the terms, the relationships, and the importance of disaster risk communication in this very short session. So I hope we were at least able to describe the evolution of the disaster risk management as a concept. And what are those? Initially, act of God, a seeming resignation. We also have the natural science approach where we look at how nature behaves. We have the applied science approach wherein we use advances information in technology like early warning system, like GIS, among others. We also had contingency planning, looking at worst case scenarios. Are you prepared for a worst case scenario? And then we have the emergency management, wherein how do we save lives quickly, the basis for humanitarian response. And lastly, the social science approach, wherein we provide human dimensions to all of this, like why do people behave the way they do? So the importance of being empathetic to them, putting ourselves in their shoes. And of course, I hope we were able to explain selected terminologies for DRM following the UNDRR definitions given. So what are those important definitions? Disaster risk reduction, DR, which is disaster risk, And what is disaster risk? Are potential losses. This has to be communicated. Now, what are the components of disaster risk? Hazard, vulnerability, exposure, capacity. Capacity is inversely proportional with vulnerability and exposure. If you want to reduce vulnerability and exposure, we need to increase capacity. And risk communication and communication plays a big part of it. We also discussed DRM, DM, the disciplines involved, which are prevention, preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery activities. And in the middle of this circle is disaster risk communication. So with that, I would like to thank you. I hope you enjoyed this session. And if you have questions, please keep in touch with us. We have sessions on mentoring and coaching. So we're always, for the next 3 weeks, we'll always be there if you need some things, some support needed. So with that, so thank you and see you again in the next sessions. Thank you.